Здравейте, евентуални зрители! Този подкаст ще бъде на английски. Ще видите в описанието как да си пуснете автоматичните субтитри. And welcome to my English-speaking viewers. Today we have a very special guest. He's a red-blooded Texan who is born to raise hell with his latest book, Provoked. I give you the writer and journalist, Scott Horton. Hello.
Hi. Thank you very much for having me. Good to be with you.
How are you today?
Doing great.
So, I've been a fan of yours for quite a while. Heard about you from Daryl Cooper, and ever since I was able to hear some of your lectures, and we're really surprised when I heard that you were writing a book, and really couldn't wait to see it. And now I still haven't read it because I was kind of busy with this. And I'm in the first Bush years, in Bush Junior. That's where I am. And from the title of the book, I get the feeling that you're really angry with what has happened, that everything in Ukraine could have been avoided, and this is why the title is Provoked, because you really see this as an avoidable problem.
Yeah, that's true. And it's also a direct contradiction to the war party and their propaganda. I don't know how they say it where you live, but around here, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 is universally called by the major media and certainly the previous administration an unprovoked attack. Unprovoked attack, unprovoked attack, unprovoked attack. They just beat it in your head like you're supposed to just be hypnotized. Whereas to me, it's the most obvious tell, right? Like, sorry, that's a colloquialism, figure of speech. It means like if you're playing poker, and whenever you're lying, you always like wiggle your eye or something like that. It's a giveaway, right? Of what you're really doing. Why are they trying so hard to make you consider even the name of the thing, the whole concept of the thing, an unprovoked attack? Well, the answer is because they provoked it and they know it, obviously. Otherwise, they could just say it was a horrible thing, an aggressive war, whatever. They could say it's unprovoked sometimes, but they say it like it's a gold coin and you're supposed to just be mesmerized and just repeat after them and not think about, well, what did happen in the lead up to this thing? Because, of course, what it is it's a major power contest over this important medium-sized country in between them is what it is. And it's clearly America's doing in provoking the thing. And so the book is not saying that what the Russians have done is justified. It's just saying that, in a sense, the Biden administration has got to be kidding me that this is an unprovoked attack. It is not either. They did everything they could, not necessarily deliberately, but they and their predecessors took numerous steps on the road toward confrontation with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, when everybody thought we'd be best friends forever and it'd be fine and there'd be nothing to fight about. Now here we are just 30 years later, and we have not even 25 years later, we already had a huge contest with them going on in Ukraine. So that's what the book is about. It's just the backstory. And so that's what I bring to it, as I tell long stories. You mentioned you're at W. Bush. So the book starts out with his father, H.W. Bush, at the end of the last Cold War. And then I do the whole 1990s and Bill Clinton years. And then there's W. Bush, and those are just the chapters, are the presidents. W. Bush and Obama, Trump and Biden, to finish it up. And just to take you through the story. This is what the various administrations did. This is where they tried to get along with the Russians. This is where they didn't mind provoking them, getting away with bloody murder at Russian expense. And so that's basically how the story's told.
I'm really surprised also by the scope, because it takes you from the collapse of the Soviet Union all the way through Yugoslavia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan and Chechnya. And that's also a part where I really thought you were really angry, because some of what Washington did here around the Balkans and Afghanistan came back to bite you in a very horrible way.
That's right. So I'm not sure how familiar with this people are. I like to think that most Americans have heard of this, and most people in the world, but America and Saudi Arabia, especially, and I guess Britain somewhat as well, worked with Pakistan to back the Mujahideen in the war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s in Afghanistan. And not only that, but they helped to bring Muslims from around the world, including the United States, Chechnya, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and all over, but especially Arabs, to create what they call the International Islamic Brigades. And they participated in the war essentially against the Soviet Union and were allegedly helpful to the local Mujahideen in some important battles during that war. Well, of course, the Soviets withdrew in 1989 from Afghanistan, and their commie dictator, sock puppet dictator there, ended up being able to cling on to power still until 1991, when the different warring Mujahideen factions finally took over the capital city and lynched him. At that point, you had thousands of out-of-work Mujahideen, and they were the International Islamic Brigades. And so what they all had in common was Islam, and especially the Saudi-led brand of this extremist kind of take on it all, and combined with the radical politics of Abdullah Azzam and then his successor, Osama bin Laden. And so these are the same guys who then, as soon as that was over, they went on to Bosnia, where America was on their side when the Bosnian Muslims fought against the Bosnian Serbs, and from time to time the Croatians. They switched back and forth during the thing, but especially during against the Bosnian Serbs. And then again in Kosovo in 1999, where the bin Ladenites were embedded within what was called the Kosovo Liberation Army, they were mostly gangsters and heroin dealers and drug runners and organ thieves, but they also were tied with these bin Ladenites who helped them they were fighting to create a greater Albania. It was what their goal was at that time. And America again sided with them. And then worst of all, in Chechnya, which it was an absolutely horrible war there. And America certainly backed Russia in the first war in Chechnya in the 1994, 1995 time period. And then in the 1999 through early 2000s war, America was nominally on Russia's side. I don't know if they explicitly gave them aid to help in the second war, but if they did, they definitely rhetorically backed them, against fighting against terrorists and fighting against separatists. But they also backed them. And it was kind of the vanguard of the war party and the neoconservative movement were kind of avowedly pro-Chechen. But there was also covert support run by the United States, Britain, and Saudi Arabia, by our intelligence agencies, helping to run these mujahideen, from battle to battle, serving our interests. And I'm not one of the guys who says that the CIA and the Saudis and the Israelis and whoever did the September 11th attack. That's not my point. My point is that at the same time that America was supporting and helping to internationalize and really entrench the networks of these terrorists in power, even into Europe, from Afghanistan, from no man's land way out in Afghanistan all the way to Bosnia in the Balkans. And then from there, not in large numbers, but in important numbers, into Western Europe and eventually the United States, where they attacked us. And the idea was, essentially, we have a saying in America, too clever by half, where somebody's trying to get away with doing something wrong, and it kind of blows up in their face and causes a bad problem. So that's essentially what we have here is, even though Al-Qaeda was already attacking the United States, they started attacking our guys in Yemen in 92. Then they hit the World Trade Center in 93. They hit the Americans training the Saudi National Guard in 95 and the Khobar Towers barracks in 1996. The African embassies in 1998 and the battleship Cole in the year 2000. And this whole time, Bill Clinton's still on their side. Because the idea is, they're like, yeah, these are mostly pinprick attacks. Even the worst potential one, the first World Trade Center bombing, only 6 people died. And then the worst one, the Africa embassies, it's mostly Africans that died. And they said, terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower. We get to rule all the nation states of the world. And the worst we have to suffer is a little bit of blowback terrorist attacks from our own mercenaries, our own terrorist guerrillas that we send from place to place to fight. Oh, well. And that was the attitude. And that's a direct quote from the Joint Staff on the Pentagon, the Pentagon Joint Staff, the leaders of American policy planning for the military. That's just the way it goes. That's a small price to pay, they would say. And so then when the bin Ladenites were motivated to attack the United States for separate reasons, namely America occupying Saudi Arabia in order to bomb Iraq for 10 years, and also support for Israel against the Palestinians and the Lebanese, along with support for all the various Sunni tyrannies, especially in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, and rigging the oil price against them, and et cetera, some other reasons, but all very political ones. The Americans essentially had a lackadaisical attitude about protecting the American people from the terrorists that they had, one, supported and built up, and then two, motivated to turn against us. And that's what led to the September 11th attack. And as I show in the book, 11 of the 19 hijackers had fought or at least been to Bosnia and Chechnya. And these were the same guys who crashed their planes into the Pentagon and into the World Trade Center. And so you can see why some people jump to the conclusion that, the American CIA and the Saudis and the Israelis and whoever just had these guys do it in order to accomplish their goals. But I don't really think that's what it was. I think essentially the cops would have actually had to care about the American people and not just themselves. And they would have had to been willing to try hard to protect us, and they weren't willing, So that's what happened.
What you did very well also is that you described that this is not done just to do it. It's done to propel American interests with pipelines and natural resource extraction and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. And as I say in the book, I quote the experts. I quote the people involved in the process, especially in running those pipelines out of the Caspian Basin, that this is about global strategy first, business second. The businessmen were happy to cut a pipeline right across Iran, but the Israel lobby says no to that. And you could, cut pipelines here and there across Russian territory too. Cut them in on some royalties. That might be good for our relations. Might be priceless in its benefit for the overall goodwill between America and Russia being maintained, to let them make some money off some pipelines that our companies build and want to run through their country to Europe, etc. But nope, the whole game was cut the Russians out, keep them out, make no compromise with them. They even lied to the Azerbaijanis when they said, which they pretty much owned anyway, but they still had to lie to them to get them. No, pardon me. It was the Georgians that they had to lie to. And no, wait. No. I was right the first time. It was Azerbaijanis. It was Aliyev. They had to lie to him and say, listen, if you let us do this pipeline, we promise we'll let you do the Russian pipeline too. We'll do it. We'll work with them to build a joint pipeline. But they were lying, and they knew they were lying. They had to. And then if you look at the map, the all-important BTC pipeline, which is actually not that important, but it was alleged to be, it cuts from Azerbaijan across Georgia to Turkey, and then where it hits the port of Cheyenne at the Mediterranean Sea to ship that oil off to Europe. Cutting a corridor virtually due west, cutting out Iran and Russia, making sure that they can't get it. And, you know, as I show in the book, the oil companies were annoyed with all of this. They were being forced to spend billions of dollars extra on pipelines that went uneconomical directions, but that was the will of the nation states.
Yeah. The question of NATO expansion hasn't started since 2014 or 2018 or 2007. It started way back in the 80s, in the late 80s, right? And where along the way the topic of NATO expansion became Russian disinformation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, okay, so yes, you're right. For people who are unfamiliar, the Soviet Union began to unravel really in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what happened was I believe it was Hungarians started crossing the border into Austria, neutral Austria. And the commie border guards did not machine gun them and stop them and let them go. And once that started, that was it. It was the proverbial dam broke open, and the communist hold over all of Eastern Europe began to unravel. And by Christmas Day, 1991, the entire Soviet Union was gone. The hardline communists had tried to do a coup against Gorbachev, the Soviet dictator at the time, the premier at the time, in August of 91, but it failed. And in the aftermath of its failure, the new Russian government overthrew what was left of the Soviet Union and the communist dictatorship there. So that's the time frame, is between 1989 and 1991 is the final unraveling there. Now, H.W. Bush took power in 1989, in January of 1989, and served through the beginning of 1993. So that's his time frame for his presidency. Ronald Reagan's successor, George Bush Sr. So just to get everybody's time frame straight there, how this happened. So he was essentially the guy in charge of the U.S. government, overseeing the warming of the relationship and the unraveling of the USSR. And he was, if he'd been telling the truth, it would have been nice, but it was nice anyway that he was lying. What happened was, as he put it, he refused to tap dance on the Berlin Wall. He refused to rub the Russians' face in it and say, haha, we won and you lost the Cold War and you're losers and we're winners and all of this stuff. Instead, he played it cool. And he told Gorbachev, we promise not to take advantage of your new weakened position. If the Eastern European countries want to leave your alliance, your Warsaw Pact alliance, then we would not take advantage of that, he said. So that was beginning in 1989. And then his government essentially cut that same posture, and it depends on how much time we have, how far we want to get into that. But essentially, the promise was made that, one, we won't expand NATO. And even though, okay, yes, we're going to reunite Germany within NATO, we still promise not to put substantial military forces in the east of the country, nor nuclear weapons in the east of the country. And we promise not to expand beyond that. And those assurances were given not just by James Baker, but by Robert Gates, who was at that time the National Security Advisor, Deputy Director CIA. I always forget. And then, but also the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his foreign minister Hans Dietrich Genscher, as well as the British Prime Ministers Margaret Thatcher and her successor John Major, and their foreign minister Douglas Hurd, and then I forgot the successor's name, but they all gave these same assurances over and over again. NATO will not expand to Poland, to Hungary, to the Czechoslovakia, as it was still called then, and to make it essentially shining them on, right? To make it easier for the Soviet Union to withdraw and ultimately to unravel. So in that sense, it was great. But the problem was that they were lying. part of the lie was they said, listen, NATO is not going to expand, but even if it did, that wouldn't matter anyway, because NATO is going to become a political organization. Think of it like the EU plus the United States, focused on, democratic norms and the rule of law and whatever. And we're going to replace NATO as a military organization with the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is now known as the organization, the OSCE, and which already had existed since 1975, and which Russia and all the former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states were already all members of. So they said, we're going to make the CSCE be the security partnership and the leading security organization in Europe. And then this is the same lie that the Bill Clinton administration inherited, and they told it too. They had a different spin on it. They said, we're going to call it the PFP, the Partnership for Peace. And again, you'll all be members. And so even if all the Eastern European countries join with the United States, the Russians don't have to feel insecure about that because they'll be members too. And NATO will be relegated to this lesser non-military role. Well, they were lying. They never meant that. They wanted the Soviets and then later the Russians to believe that. But in their own papers, in their own documents, the way they spoke to each other, they knew this was not true. The whole game was establishing permanently and enhancing American dominance in Europe. If it's not us, it'll be the Germans. And we don't want that. We want it to be us. And so, and not only that, we want to expand the military alliance to Eastern Europe. And as you were hinting in your question there, they said all along that they recognized that what this really means is they're not erasing the dividing lines in Europe. They're simply moving the line east. And yes, the alliance is still and always will be containment. Now they called it neo-containment of Russia. And see, they couldn't, even though everybody was acting all nice at the time, they couldn't, in their minds, one, come home and just let Europe sort out their own problems. Without Nazism or communism, who cares? They'll figure it out, right? Come home. Forget that. So the second option then being truly bring Russia into NATO too, or do this CSCE, or this Partnership for Peace scheme, where we're equal partners with them. They weren't willing to do that because, as Bush Sr. put it, we won, they lost. They don't get to say how things go, now we do. And so, and that attitude prevailed. See, Germany and certainly the smaller Eastern European states, they're going to do whatever America says in the NATO alliance, mostly because they're worried about Russia. They just prefer to be bossed around by us than them, quite frankly, right? Based on recent experience, you could understand. But Russia is just too big. And they have their own massive military. I mean, at that time, it had been profoundly shrunk, but still they had thousands of hydrogen bombs and the means to deliver them. And they literally rule all of Northern Asia, which ain't nothing, right? Even though a lot of that is tundra and whatever, it's still, Russia is a major power in form. And they had too much power to share decision-making with them. Instead of going along with whatever the United States said, they were sure to disagree and try to have their way. And the American idea was, well, then we'll just keep them on the outside then. We're not going to bring them in and sit here and argue with them about how things are going to go. Things are going to go, again, as Bush Sr. said, what we say goes. That's the international law. What we say goes. The American president and his National Security Council, they will decide. And so, but then what does that mean? That means just as obvious as it is to you and me right now is how obvious it was to all the experts in the 1990s. This is going to lead to a conflict. At some point, Russia's going to get up off of their knees, start making some money, adopt actual, rule of law and market capitalism and start making profits on their exports of raw and semi-finished materials, and they're going to make money and they're going to have the ability to throw their weight around again. And at that point, we will be standing on their front porch, guaranteeing the independence of every last state in Eastern Europe. And when it comes to Ukraine, and it's also true for Estonia as well, although it's a little more cut and dry there, they just have this one major kind of Russian city in Eastern Estonia. But in Ukraine, they all said this going back all the way to the 1990s. If we expand NATO to Eastern Europe, we're immediately raising the question, well, what of Ukraine? We're going to leave them out? Then we leave them to Russia's tender mercies. We bring them in, we provoke a fight with Russia immediately, because Russia's just never going to accept American and Western dominance in Ukraine, when so much of that country had belonged to Russia for 300 years. And now the communists drew the borders in funny places, but you have not just Russian speakers, but so-called ethnic Russians there, as they define themselves in the far eastern and southern parts of that country. And you have the all-important Sevastopol naval base on the Crimean Peninsula. And so they knew that if we force this issue, it could lead to war. And they all said it, and then what? They all did it anyway. And they spent, 25 years following that exact same policy. And as I show in the book, they all played their role. W. Bush escalated the conflict severely with the Orange Revolution and the Bucharest Declaration, where he promised to bring Ukraine into NATO eventually someday, just getting them in a fight with their more powerful neighbor without the promise of protection, although that probably would have provoked an immediate invasion anyway. And then Obama, of course, played his role in backing the Maidan Revolution of 2014 and the subsequent war in the East, which, according to the CIA, we know, Freudian slip, according to the New York Times, we now know that the CIA was there, if not before the coup, and during it, the putsch maybe is a more accurate term for it. They were certainly there from the day after and running the whole so-called civil war on behalf of Kiev from 2014 on. They had 14 bases, the CIA did, inside Ukraine, running that whole war. And that was, the policy that Trump inherited. And because of the Russiagate scandal, even though despite his honest, better intentions, he ended up escalating the conflict in his own way by providing more arms and so forth to defend against accusations of being a Russian puppet, which were completely false. And then Joe Biden came in, and he might as well have been the president the whole time anyway. He supported every bad and wrong choice that all of his predecessors had made the whole time as a senator, and then as Obama's vice president. He had been absolutely horrible on NATO expansion his entire career, from the early 90s on. And much of this could be said to be his fault before he ever was sworn in as president. And then he was sworn in as president and marched us straight to war through the year 2021. And that's not to absolve the Russians of their side of this. Again, the whole argument was, we're going to provoke a response from the Russians, right? It doesn't absolve them of their chosen response and the horrible violence and suffering that they've caused with it. But it does explain it.
Yeah, well, you said we're going to provoke a response. That was, as I remember, a Rand Corporation research where they made this assumption that they are going to provoke the Russians as much as they can until they get a response.
Isn't that interesting? I'm so glad you brought that up. So this study was from the Rand Corporation from, I believe it was November or December of 2009. No, pardon me, 2019, I meant to say. So Donald Trump's second to last year of his first term. Now, the Rand Corporation is a think tank out in California that's sponsored by the Pentagon. It supposedly is less close to the Pentagon than it used to be. I don't know. But I believe it's still funded by the Air Force. And the purpose of it was to be way out in California where they can do their own thinking independent of all the pressures in Washington and all the politics in Washington. And so they'd be free to come up with their own smart, horrible ideas. So this study that you're talking about, it's called Extending Russia. That's the title of it. So what do they mean by extending? They mean overextending Russia. That's the point of it. That's the point of the whole document. Overextending Russia. Well, so what does that mean? That means provoking Russia. How to provoke Russia into overextending itself. That's what it's talking about. That's the whole point of the thing. What can we do to make Russia have to react? Well, we could mess with their Nord Stream pipeline. We could try another coup in Belarus. We could increase weapons to Ukraine. We could increase weapons to the terrorists in Syria. We could do, meddling or even a coup in Kazakhstan, which is the most important of the stans, the biggest and the one that shares the giant border with Russia.
And the space station.
Is the space station in there? I forgot.
I think there's several. I think Baikonur. I'm not sure.
I'll have to go back and reread the thing now. And in fact, there's a second study that now I'm trying to remember how I treated the second study in the book. Did I just ignore it, or did I say like, oh, it was basically the same, but it added just a couple things? I forget now, but something's ringing a bell that there was a second RAND study following up on extending Russia. But the thing is this about it, okay, is like, look, this is these guys' job is to write this study about how to provoke Russia into overextending itself, right? That's okay. So they tell you how to do it. Here's what you could do that would drive the Russians nuts and would make them have to spend money, would make them have to change their policy, would make them have to divert forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But on every one of the recommendations, they come with a giant disclaimer. Hope that word, is familiar to your audience. It means like in legal liability. We're doing this contract. I'm trimming your trees, but if the disclaimer, the tree falls on your house and you have to get your roof fixed, I'm not paying for that because I told you this tree is in a precarious position. I might not be right. Disclaimer. It's a terrible example, but anyway, I never was in tree trimming. I was a roofer for a while. But these all have disclaimers on them. They say, listen, don't do what we're recommending here. Okay? If you back the terrorists in Syria, well, yeah, that could cause a headache for Russia and their client Assad. But that could also, by definition, means helping Osama bin Laden's men. These are dangerous suicide bomber, head chopper terrorist lunatics, and they threaten to seize Damascus. Well, you got to be really careful about backing bin Ladenites, the RAND Corporation says. The same ones that we saw sack Damascus last December, right? And who rule Damascus right now due to that, after they broke out of Idlib province and took over Syria last November and December. And they say, I forgot their disclaimer about Belarus and Kazakhstan and the Nord Stream and whatever, but surely they say, in the case of Ukraine, if we escalate support for Ukraine, that empowers them on the battlefield in the ongoing so-called low-level war, in the civil war with the so-called rebels in the east of the country. And that would increase costs for Russia and make them have to spend more money and on weapons and logistics and whatever intelligence and whatever they're doing to help the rebels in the east of the country. It would drive up their costs there. But then they say, disclaimer, if we do that, they might decide, the Russians might decide that they've had enough and they might just invade and send in regular forces and seize the Donbass, that is Donetsk and Luhansk, in far eastern Ukraine, or more, or even worse. And which would be extraordinarily costly to us and to our allies in Kiev as well. And so you better be careful about following our advice. We're telling you how to set the world on fire, but we're also warning you, if you do this, we told you, you might think twice about it. You better not, because this is what could happen. And the whole study reads like that. Here's how to provoke Russia. Here's why you probably shouldn't do it. And when you look at the Biden administration in 21, 22, it just looks like they read or even late Trump. Because late Trump, they did try to overthrow Belarus again in 20. I don't know if he signed off on that or not, but that may have been Putin's final straw right there in Trump's last year in power. They tried another color-coded revolution type putsch in Belarus as recommended in that thing. But if you read it, you would think that the government just ignored all the disclaimers, or they just got a copy that had none of the disclaimers and none of the warnings. You know, here's all the things you could do. Here's why you shouldn't do them. But they just ignored all the shouldn'ts and went ahead, and you could just tell they implemented the whole thing. And we do not have, I don't believe, any journalism saying, like government officials saying, yep, we followed that Rand study, all right, that was our blueprint or anything. I don't think we have anything that official. However, you could tell that they definitely were implementing that policy, or a policy that was influenced by people who read that study and encoded it somewhere else or whatever. But it's clearly part of the thinking of what they were doing here. So, and you know what? One more thing. They say in there, talking about Ukraine, we have to carefully calibrate the amount of weapons that we pour in, right? So calibrate like on a machine, a dial with, you know, some tensions. You got to get fast. Exactly right. So yeah, something carefully balanced, right? We want to send in enough weapons to deter Russia from invading. We don't want to send in so many weapons that they decide that they better invade, because that could be their thinking, could go either way there. So we have to carefully calibrate. We're trying to modify Russian behavior with our calibration dial of weapon deliveries. And we better think very carefully about how we do that. Well, we see that same language come up in a report about the CIA in Ukraine at the start of the war. In January of 2022, some CIA officers told a journalist for Yahoo News named Zach Dorfman that we tried to tell our bosses back home to tell the politicians in Washington that the calibration is off. You have to calibrate these things very carefully, and they have not done that. Instead, they're not putting in enough weapons to really deter Russia, but they are putting in just the right amount to really provoke them into action, to make them think that if they're obviously going to have, that they're obviously going to have to fight Ukraine. They're being armed up for war. And so therefore then, if they're going to have to fight them, they better fight them now while they only have X number of Javelin anti-tank missiles rather than X plus 1,000. So better just go now. And that was their same language. Calibration. So it's like the principal agent problem, right? Joe Biden says, well, send some weapons, boys. And then like it's somebody else's job to calibrate it, but nobody's calibrating it. There's no calibration and there's no deterrence. The Russians are not deterred. The Russians are instead deciding, I guess we better take what we mean to take now before matters are worse for us. And so that was what they did. And then, as your audience probably knows, the war was meant to force Kiev to the table, which worked. And they were negotiating a peace deal. And then America and Britain, and now we find out from Boris Johnson, but I believe it too. I mean, this sounds like an excuse of his, but it's a very plausible one, that the far right-wing nationalists from the far west of the country, they all, America, Boris Johnson, and the Nazis all vetoed the peace deal. And the Nazis consider any negotiation with Russia to be a sellout and like in a sunk cost fallacy, that it means if we end the war now, it means that everyone who already died in the war died for nothing. And that's treason, and so we'll kill you. And they had promised to kill the previous president, Poroshenko, as well as Zelensky, if he made peace with the Russians, even before the war. When Zelensky first took power in 2019, they threatened to hang him from a tree on the main drag in Kiev if he did not back away from the prospect of renewed negotiations with Russia that the Germans were trying to push forward at that time. So he's in a tough spot, that guy. And keep your eye on Andriy Beletsky. He's the leader of now what's called the Azov Corps, or the Third Corps of the Ukrainian army. It used to be the Azov Battalion, and then they changed it to the 3rd Separate Infantry Division. Another part of it is a special regiment of the National Guard. But the main bulk of the Azov Battalion is now known as the 3rd Corps, promoted from regiment to battalion to corps now. And this guy, Beletsky, he's going to be regarded as a war hero by the Ukrainian side in this thing. He's been leading guys. They even took a little bit of territory in Luhansk recently. And as I just said, he had his whole organization promoted from a brigade to a corps. And this guy's a avowed Hitler-loving Nazi, just 100% Nazi, and not ashamed at all. And I quote him at length in my book. You'll see him often quoted saying that we must lead the world in a crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen, was the quote. But I have the text of that whole speech, and I had to cut some of it out for space. But I included as much of it as I possibly could. And the guy's an absolute raving lunatic, like the worst raving lunatic neo-Nazi you would ever hear rambling about anything. And this is the guy, they call him White Rex. And this is the guy, he's going to be a powerful kingmaker. If he doesn't die on the battlefield sometime soon, if he lives through this war, he and his likes are going to be powerful new forces in Ukrainian politics, much more than even before, where they already had quite a bit of sway. So we'll see how that goes. Call it blowback.
I'm going to bring you back to the RAND study, because I didn't know that there were disclaimers in it. And usually disclaimers, I would put them if someone ordered something from me, to know, let them know, if you do this, exactly as you described it, if you do this will follow. And if someone orders something like that, how to extend Russia and to not maybe provoke war or do, I find it to be really silly and to show a lack of competency level on the person who orders such thing. And this was one of my questions. In your research, have you seen, can you point a finger on a date where you see, wow, this is when you could say this is a really poor decision, and this is being made but by a person who is not qualified for the position he is in?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few of those. I mean, the most obvious one would be W. Bush and the Bucharest Declaration of 2008. Now, first of all, the Bucharest Declaration was a sort of half-assed promise to bring Ukraine into NATO someday. Now, America had various deals with Ukraine, and NATO had various deals with Ukraine dating back to the late 1990s of cooperation and some training and some weapon sales and this kind of, more lower level stuff. But Bush wanted to give them what's called a membership action plan, which is a real, plan of a few steps that must be taken for a country to join the NATO alliance, as so many had already done on that same process, right? But I'm skipping to the end here. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and Francois Hollande, from the President of France, they put their foot down, especially Merkel put her foot down and told W. Bush, you can't do this. So he said, okay, well, we'll just do this declaration, and we won't give them a membership action plan, but we'll just promise them that we're going to bring them into NATO someday. And then he's on his way out of power. This is in April of 2008. He's not even going to be a president for another year. He's gone by January. But he's putting, all of America and all of Ukraine and everybody in between and everyone in Russia and all these people on the hook for this decision. And what it is, again, is a promise that you're going to join our military alliance someday, but you're actually not even on the official track to do so. We're not even giving you an official membership action plan, but we're promising you're going to be a member of our military alliance. But like, if someone was to attack you now, then yeah, we're not coming. Right? So really just getting them in big trouble with their bigger, tougher neighbor. without any good cause. And this is the kind of thing, you know, I'm for not doing this at all. But I agree with all of the different academics and whoever, the way that they put it. Their term is, this is the worst of all worlds, to offer them to join a military alliance without giving them the war guarantee. Now, I'm not saying it would have been better with the war guarantee. I'm saying it'd be better to not do this at all. And in fact, I think there's a circular argument from the war hawks who say, yeah, see, Bush should have just given them full membership right then and there. And then Russia wouldn't be able to do anything. Russia would never come. But I disagree with that. I think if he had gone, because he couldn't give them full membership right then and there, the best he could have done was give them a membership action plan and a real, you know, step onto the path of membership. But then I think Russia would have just invaded right then, before the ink could be dry on the treaty, before anyone could actually give them that war guarantee. I think Putin would have said, I'm sorry, W. Bush, but I'm going to test that premise. And he would have invaded right then with whatever he had to prevent that from happening. I'm virtually certain of that. And that was the thinking in the government at the time. So to go back to the beginning of the year, Joe Biden's CIA director, William Burns, he was W. Bush's ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a memo to Condoleezza Rice that was leaked by Bradley Manning and posted on WikiLeaks called "Niet means Niet." And everyone can read it. Just type in wikileaks.org, "Niet means Niet, William Burns," and it'll come right up. It's from February of 2008. And Burns says, listen, I talked to everybody in politics in Moscow. He says, from the most enlightened pro-Western liberals to the most backwards barbarian knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin. I talked to all the guys at all the think tanks, and I sat down and I talked with the foreign minister. And here's what they all tell me. You can't bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. You just can't do it, and especially not Ukraine. It's the brightest of red lines. And they're really upset about it, and they're really worried about it, and they're really trying hard to get us to understand that we would be putting them in the most difficult position. And he quotes Sergei Lavrov, still the foreign minister of Russia, saying that, listen, if you really move to bring Ukraine into NATO, that's going to cause major dissension inside the country. Now, you could call that a veiled threat to intervene or not, either way. It could cause a major dissension inside the country. It could cause a civil war in Ukraine. And then Russia might have to intervene. A decision we do not want to have to face. That's what he says. Right? In plainer English, don't put me in this position.
Yeah.
Right? And Burns says, hey, he means it. And hey, he's kind of got a point.
And he's not
right?
alone.
He's not alone. This is the entire consensus in the government. It's not just Putin. This is all of Moscow's popular will. The entire national security establishment in Russia agrees with this. And you know what, Madam Secretary? Pretty sure we should listen. And we know that Burns really agreed because he published in his memoir a separate email that he had sent to Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, where he said, listen, if I haven't convinced you by now, you might as well just stop reading because I don't know what to do with you. But anyway, and then he continues to elaborate, but you could tell he's just fed up with this argument. But he's saying, like, this is my last shot to try to convince you. You got to stop Bush from doing this. It's in his memoir. Then he also wrote in his memoir that he thought that Rice did agree with him. And we also know that the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, same Robert Gates that promised not to expand NATO East back in 1990, same Robert Gates, he wrote in his memoir that he thought Bush was vastly overreaching here. And he's that's what he says. And he's really like rude about it. He really slaps Bush down. You get the idea that he must have warned W. Bush not to do this. And here's kind of his payback as he really slams Bush for making an idiotic move here. The way he characterizes it. And then we also know that, and this is kind of funny to me still, there's this so-called Russia expert, this British-American woman named Fiona Hill, who you might remember from testifying against Donald Trump in Ukraine-gate. And she was in Bush's government, in Obama's government, and in Trump's government. And she says that now, if you believe this, agree with her, repeat this, then you're the victim of a Russian psyop. But she tells the story and has told it numerous times, including in the New York Times Weekend magazine in this big puff piece all about how special she is. How she warned W. Bush, don't do it. She was the head of the Russia desk on the National Security Council. And we know that the head of the she was the head of the Ukraine desk on the National Security Council. And we already know that the head of the Russia desk on the National Security Council was a guy named Thomas Graham, who was also a Duff and was also opposed to this. And she said, everyone on the National Security Council agrees. Don't do this. And we polled all the intelligence community, and they all agree. In other words, Russia House, which is the core of experts at CIA on Russia, they said, don't do this. I don't know if they had an official national intelligence estimate about it or not, but the National Security Council called all the agencies, and all the agencies said, yeah, we don't think you should. Burns also in his memoir said, the whole embassy here in Moscow agrees with me too. Or he wrote that in his memoir, that the whole embassy agreed with him. So you have the ambassador and his staff and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the entire National Security Council, and reporting that also all the agencies agree, don't do this. And and Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel and their governments all agree, don't do this. Why not? Why not? There was only one reason. It's an unnecessary provocation of Russia. There's no need to do this. It's just going to cause a fight. Why would we do this? Don't do it. They all said it. And this is W. Bush's own government. This is not the pansy feminist Democrats, the weaklings or something. This is Bush's own government is telling him, man, no. But he does it anyway. And William Burns wrote in his memoir, the reason why? A legacy building operation for W. Bush. He wanted to go down in history as doing something big and important. And the Iraq War was a complete disaster. The Afghan War was a complete disaster. The Somalia War was a complete disaster. He wanted to gangsterize the entire Social Security Trust Fund and put it in a stock market bubble, the same one that crashed before he was able to leave office in September of 2008. Wasn't able to get away with that. So what was his legacy? He was widely renowned as among the worst American presidents ever. Lied us into war with Iraq. Told the American people Iraq was going to attack us if we didn't attack him first. Oh my God, are you kidding? And then in hindsight, people were so pissed that they'd fallen for that and then got their cousin killed. And just, everyone hated his guts. His approval rating was in the high 20%. His legacy of torture, including torturing 108 people to death. And so he had to do something big and important for himself, for his legacy. And yet, the reason his whole government told him not to do it was right. It's an unnecessary provocation of Russia. It's not a win for his legacy. It's another big crapshoot if it works out, but it didn't work out. It was a horror show. And that idiot had no right to be sitting in that chair anyway. It's got to be, and I don't know how the rest of the world feels about this, and I'm from Texas. He's not. He's from Connecticut. The thing is, to me, it's the ultimate irony of the universe that man was inaugurated to sit in that chair behind that desk in the first month of the new millennium, in January of 2001. The least capable, least interested, and least moral person. Just an absolute numbnuts, absolute scumbag, a liar and a cheat and a know-nothing, an absolute idiot. The least capable president that we've had. I mean, I guess you could say Biden tied with him. You know, and Biden was already horrible, absolutely horrible. But once he got senility, he became as absolutely worthless as George W. Bush. And the irony that he was able to take, it's not just became the president of the United States. He took control of the world empire. He had the destiny of mankind in his hands. And he had no idea what to do with it, except because he's a horrible person, he could only choose to do horrible and wrong things, like starting wars and telling lies and torturing people to death and expanding military alliances where they got no business expanding. And for, of course, his own selfish, stupid, self-interested purposes. And so, yeah. And I do hate them all, but he's got to be the worst.
He's going to be remembered for his great Freudian slip when he said the unprovoked invasion of Iraq instead of Ukraine. But
and then he admitted it. He said Iraq too.
Yeah, Iraq too.
Yeah, that wasn't Freudian. That was just a blatant, I plead guilty to war crimes, Your Honor, because he called it an unjustified and brutal invasion. That was what he said. Well, unjustified invasion sounds illegal. Sounds like an aggressive war, and that he just confessed to killing 1 million people, premeditated murder.
Whenever I found two people around here. One of them was able to say that back in 2015 that let's see if we get to avoid war in 2022. And when I asked him, how are you able to specifically say it's 2022 that a major war may happen, his answer was missile treaties. And I double checked with another person, and both of them said missile treaties. And you're right about the START treaty, and I forgot the other one. But it's
INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they both pointed to this event that it's basically provoking the war, and that they were able by this event to predict that it was 2022, that it was going to be the year of an invasion or war.
Actually, well, so I mean, Trump just tore up the INF treaty. He just withdrew from it. I don't believe it was set to expire. I think it was a permanent treaty. The New START treaty was set to expire in 2021, and Biden and Putin saved it. It's still there, although the Russians claim to no longer be bound by it, but I don't think that they've begun violating its rules yet. But it's still officially in force, the New START treaty. The other one that they let expire was the Open Skies Treaty, where they allow unarmed military flights over each other's countries to reassure each other that they're not preparing for war or mobilizing for war. So I'm not sure. And I'm sorry, who was it that you said made that prediction and when in 2018?
2015. And it was...
in 2015. And who was it that said that?
A friend.
Oh, okay.
That now doesn't want to come on.
Oh, I see. Well, I'd have to go back and ask exactly what they mean by that. But clearly one of the major issues that Putin brought up, aside from NATO membership and the ongoing war in the East, was sort of a corollary to the potential NATO membership, and that was the possibility that America would put these anti-ballistic missile systems near Kharkiv, or near the Russian border in far eastern Ukraine. And the thing is about these missile launchers, it's called Aegis on shore. So Aegis is the super sophisticated naval radar system, but it's combined with these Sparrow. They're called Sparrow anti-ballistic missiles, right? Defensive missiles, and I forget their exact number, designation, and everything. I used to know it, but the problem is the missile launchers themselves. It's called the MK-41 or the Mark 41 missile launcher, and those missile launchers, whether on ships or on land, they can not only host these Sparrows, but they can also host Tomahawk cruise missiles, can be fired from them. And Tomahawk cruise missiles can, and especially now without the INF treaty there, can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. And so this was part of Putin's speech, was he said, listen, a ballistic missile from Kharkiv would take this long, a cruise missile from Kharkiv would take this long, and a hypersonic missile from Kharkiv would take this long. And I believe it was 20 minutes, 15 minutes, and 5 minutes. Something like that was the how he broke it down, something like that. And the thing is, we know from, various reports at the time, including the Russian version of the readout of the call. The Democrats did not post one. Biden's government didn't post one, but they didn't dispute the Russian readout of the call either, from December the 30th, 2021, where Putin says, listen, we got to negotiate these missiles. And Biden's assuring him, listen, we're not bringing Ukraine into NATO, and we're not stationing missiles in Kharkiv. So you don't have to worry about that. And Trump says, Putin says, all right, well, let's negotiate that and put it in writing then. That's what I'm demanding in my treaty. And Biden says, yeah, we can negotiate that. It'll be fine. We'll do that. We can negotiate the missiles. But then he doesn't do that. He has like lower level staff take it up and then put it off and drop the ball and not pursue it. And all he had to do was sign the treaty. And, they pretended at the time that the proposed Russian treaties were just a pretext for war, but that's not true. We knew at the time, not just from experts outside the government, like former diplomats like Chas Freeman, who came on my show and said, no, this is a legitimate proposal worth negotiating. But Biden government officials told the Post and the Times that, these are reasonable proposals, not that they're like ready, to sign on the dotted line, but could they sit down at a table and negotiate these treaties? Yeah, there's essentially a reasonable starting place for the treaties. They admitted that themselves to the major papers here. The Biden administration officials did. But then they never did that. They refused to actually pursue that and sit down at a table and negotiate any of it. And one of their negotiators is a State Department guy named Derek Chollet. And he went on a podcast and said, oh, yeah, no, we absolutely refuse to even talk about NATO at all. The only thing we'd talk about NATO is we would say to them, NATO is a defensive alliance, right? The wars in Afghanistan or Serbia, Afghanistan, and Libya don't count. NATO's a defensive alliance, and that's it. And so therefore, you should have to accept anything that we do, even if we surround your entire country, including bringing Georgia and Ukraine into our military alliance. Then, hell, maybe we'll make North Korea a member of NATO too. You'll be completely surrounded, but don't worry. It's a defensive alliance. And we say so, and that'll be good enough for you. And of course, that wasn't good enough for them. And they said, that's not good enough for us. And the Americans refused to negotiate in good faith. And I think it's pretty clear that they preferred to have a war. They thought this will be the biggest Russian blunder to invade Ukraine, which Ukraine is the size of Texas. And the idea was, even if the size of Afghanistan, the size of France, if that's, closer to your
we know all
conception
about it.
There. Yeah. Bigger than Germany. And so even if Ukraine's military was smashed, the idea was we'll still back an insurgency against them. And it'll be extraordinarily costly for the Russians. The fact that the Ukrainian military survived the initial assault and has been there to support all this time, to the Americans, Ukrainian combat losses are completely irrelevant. They've made that so clear over and over again. The only question is how many Russians are being killed for our dollar. And they don't really care how much American money they're wasting either. So the question is really just how many Russians are we killing and how much is it costing them to wage this war? And they look at that as, of course, all net loss to Russia. And of course, it means the full remilitarization of Russia and their full reorientation toward the East and away from Europe. But they don't count those costs. So they just say, literally like how many rubles is Russia spending on all these artillery shells and all these lives they're losing. And they just see all that as net loss and therefore net gain for our side, and they don't care. And they've said it over and over again. And in America, I don't know about in Europe, the way they do this, presumably they'd have a little bit more sophistication when it comes to this kind of thing. But the Americans will say over and over again, and this goes for, you know, pundits and writers and popular TV figures, but also politicians and military and government officials, senators and congressmen. They've said over and over again, they go, well, we're killing Russians. It's a great bang for our buck. It's costing us very little. No American soldiers are dying, and lots of Russians are dying. It's great. And a lot of times they don't even mention the Ukrainians at all. In David Ignatius, who's one of the most important national security journalists in Washington, D.C., writes for the Washington Post, is, you know, closely identified with the CIA and expressing their point of view on lots of things a lot of times. And Ignatius literally he says, the war has been great. It's great for our defense industrial base, meaning the military industrial complex gets to make a lot of money off of it. They brag about that amazingly. They ran out of things to brag about, so they invoke that. They say, we've expanded NATO and we forced our European partners and NATO allies to all spend more on their militaries and build them up. We brought Sweden and Finland into the thing, and Russians are dying in large numbers. And so the war has just been great for everyone. And then Ignatius literally put in parentheses, except for the Ukrainians, right, whose country's been completely destroyed, or at least the eastern third of it is being completely destroyed. Their population's being destroyed. You know, yeah, absolutely. I don't know, the 10 million or something, or almost 10 million refugees have left the country. To the east or the west, many millions of whom will never come home. You already had a massive demographic crisis there. Now you have, you know, I don't know, 300,000 or 400,000 or 500,000 dead and hundreds of thousands more maimed. An unmitigated cost, colossal disaster for the Ukrainian side. And their American so-called allies have made it clear over and over again, they don't care about them at all. In fact, on the question of NATO membership, Zelensky complained one time to CNN. It's like the weirdest thing. They tell me to keep acting like I'm going to get into NATO someday, even though they tell me that I'm not. And my thing is like, geez, would you guys make up your mind and decide? Because it's kind of not fair to put us in this position. Yeah, well, look who you're dealing with. So, you know, the Americans thought that it would be a fun little trap for the Russians. They compared it to 1980s Afghanistan. Remember that time we backed the Mujahideen Afghanistan? That worked out great. There were no consequences of that anybody needs to worry about, talk about now. So that was fine. September 11th, never heard of that. Nobody cares about that. Remember that? Let's do that again. In fact, they even invoked Syria when Obama had backed Al-Qaeda in Syria beginning in 2011, you know, through the end of his presidency in early 2017, which had blown up into the caliphate, which conquered all of Western Iraq, and which America then went to war for the Shiites again in Iraq War III to blow up the bin Ladenite caliphate that they had built. And so here it's just months after withdrawing from Afghanistan in humiliating defeat after a 20-year failed mission to clean up from the consequences of the last time we did this there. And it's just a couple of years after finally defeating the so-called ISIS caliphate in Western Iraq and Eastern Syria, but we still got troops in Syria in the name of fighting ISIS. And they go, at that time, they go, yeah, this, again, just months after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, an absolute debacle, humiliating catastrophe. And they go, yeah, that's what we should do. We should do like Afghanistan and Syria, where we back the terrorists against the Russians.
Yeah. When you said about Bush and his legacy, I remember another thing that a friend said, and it was that whatever Biden did, he did to protect his family, because Hunter is his only son left, and he's trying everything to do to protect his family. And then we had the pardons pardons that are for 12 years. How many years were the pardons apart? What was the span of time that the pardons covered?
11 years at least, right? Going back to 2014.
Yeah.
Which is just incredible to do. And even like they pardon future crimes. Like he gave people amnesty. You can't give people amnesty for future crimes they commit. That's not in the Constitution anywhere. And pardon is one thing. And usually you have to already be convicted of a crime to be pardoned for it. Although there's a couple of precedents where Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter pardoned all the draft dodgers. But otherwise, everyone's always had to been convicted of something before they could be pardoned. But I don't think that it's right that what Biden did was just to protect his son. There was nothing going on in Ukraine in 2021 that was a threat to Hunter Biden. You know, this has been part of Joe Biden's been absolutely horrible on NATO expansion and America's relationship with Russia since the end of the last Cold War. This entire time, he's been horrible on it. And what was his son even doing there? His son was there because he was the vice president who held the brief for all Ukraine policy on Barack Obama's authority, on President Obama's authority. He was in charge of Ukraine. And Zelensky, the guy, whatever you say, the guy that owned Burisma natural gas company, he had been tight with the previous government. And so he was trying to suck up to the new government, and he went over their head and just went ahead and hired the vice president of the United States' son, as well as Cofer Black, the former head of CIA counterterrorism, and a Polish politician whose name I always forget how to pronounce, but I believe a former Polish president or prime minister or something. And so he did this. He hired all these guys for protection from the new regime, so they wouldn't come after him because, hey, I'm connected to the vice president's son. And it's in the laptop that we can see in the emails where that was exactly why Hunter Biden was brought on, was to intervene with the prosecutions or any investigations or anything going on, and to bring in heavy weight from Washington to tell the locals to leave these guys alone. So in other words, Donald Trump was absolutely right that they deserved to be prosecuted, and it was corrupt that they were stopped, that the prosecutions were stopped. Joe Biden and his son should have gone to jail before they could run against Trump in 2020. He was totally right about that. They impeached him for it, and they kept the laptop a secret for another half a year when the laptop proved that Trump was right all along about all of it. But if you look at, you know, the overall constellation of Biden's actions in Ukraine through the Obama years, including leading the committee that was in charge of overthrowing the government in the first place, you'll see this doesn't revolve around Hunter Biden. It revolves around punishing Russia and you know, absorbing every last member of the former, you know, Russian Soviet republics into America's NATO empire. And then it's just a matter of time until Russia itself, you know, eventually has a regime change and falls under American control. That's their idea. That's what they have in mind for all this. They made it clear this whole time. So Biden, the younger crackhead Biden, he's just, you know, playing a role in that larger scheme.
Yeah. How do you interpret Mersheimer's Primrose Path description?
Yes, he said that on my show. Before he said that famously in that speech in 2015, he said that on my show in 2014. Right after he published his article for Foreign Affairs explaining how we're getting Ukraine into this mess. He said, listen, Russia will wreck Ukraine before they let Ukraine join our alliance. That's what they'll do. They'll just wreck it so that it can't join. And so America's leading Ukraine down the Primrose Path. That's exactly what he said. And he's completely right. In other words, hey, let's you and me go get in a fight with those toughs down the street, and I promise I got your back, and I brought my uncle's gun, right? And then, no, I'm going to actually get you into a fight, and then I'm going to run off and go play video games and leave you to get beat down by this gang of guys in a conflict I instigated. You know, that's the way America does it. When America tells you, yeah, come on, get in a fight, I got your back, don't trust them. They're a bunch of Clintons and Bushes and McCains and Bidens, the most horrible people in the entire world. You would not want them to be your allies.
No. We gotta get something clear that when you say provoked, you do not mean that Ukraine itself or the Ukrainian people provoked this, but that they were encouraged to do something very stupid. Because
the subtitle of the book is how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. And it's true that there are some Ukrainians that play their part in the thing, of course. And so who am I to deny any individual agency over the decisions that they made? But there are very powerful forces at play here as well, of course.
Yeah. I forgot my thought. Well, the interesting thing about the book is that it ends. What page did it end at? Before the remarks start.
What's the last page of the book?
Yeah, was it page 600 or was it somewhere around there?
Yes, it's I believe it's 670.
And after that,
that's actually a lie, because the book is very small print and it's 7x10.
Yeah.
So when the final 6x9 hardback comes out, it'll be 938 pages. I'm sorry, I did have it up to 1,400 pages, and I was able to cut out quite a bit of it, but I had to stop at some point, even though I really wasn't finished. There's a lot more that could be in there.
The interesting thing is that the story ends at a certain point, and it's all remarks from then on, and it's at 4,000 remarks. Was it?
I'm sorry, what was the question? It's all after I stop telling the story, I start just complaining. Is that what
you're saying? No. It's remarks in what do you call it? The numbers that in the digital version.
The footnotes?
The footnotes, the footnotes.
Yes, the footnotes. Yeah, so the footnotes are all at the bottom of the page. I mean, if you have it on the electronic version, I guess they're all at the back. But if you the paperback version of the book, all the footnotes are at the bottom of the page. But it is 6,000 footnotes.
Yeah.
And 7,900 citations, because a lot of times there are multiple citations per footnote. So in some cases, there will be more footnotes on a page than text, although that doesn't happen that often. But and I have, if people go to scotthorton.org/provoked/notes, I have all of the footnotes there, but also with working links. Just like if you get the Kindle version, the notes all have working links, whereas in the book, I had to take all the links out, which, by the way, when I took the links, just the web address is out of the footnotes in that tiny little 8-point font. Mm-hmm. That saved 77 pages.
Yeah.
It was 77 pages just of web addresses in the thing. Isn't that funny?
The beautiful thing about the book is that it serves as a Bible about the Cold War and the new Cold War period. And that's the most important thing about it, that it comes with the receipts for every action and for every decision that was made. And that was interesting to me. How much time did it take you to form this, to create the book?
About 2.5 years, a little less than that.
And
so I originally had given a speech in 2020 all about this, on February 29th, 2020. So it's just almost exactly 2 years later, the war broke out. So I just doubled the article. I stayed up one night and just essentially doubled the length of the thing with new stuff about the war. And then I gave it as a speech just a couple of days later in Utah, to, I believe it was a Libertarian Party group there. And then it was the state of Utah Libertarians had me out. And then I didn't really get back to work on it very much until the summer. So I was helping the good guys take over the Libertarian Party from the bad guys. So that was good. But then I didn't really get started on writing the book heavily until that summer. And then it came out in November of last year. So it's about 2.5 years.
Wow. It ends with the election of Donald Trump for a second time, correct?
Yeah.
And how does the new Trump administration strike you?
Well, he was sincere about wanting to end this war. As I say in the book, it's going to be very difficult for him to do because the Western side, Ukraine's side, is in a position of weakness on the battlefield. The Russians can get what they want. I saw a headline today. The Russians say, in order to get a further ceasefire, they want sanctions relief. In other words, they know they can make whatever demands that they want at this point. The Americans don't really have any cards to play. We can add more sanctions. We can send more weapons, but we already tried that. Donald Trump can make offers. He can, Americans always talk about carrots and sticks because the rest of the world, you're all a bunch of donkeys, see? So we either hold a carrot in front of you to make you chase the carrot, or we beat you with a stick till you do what we want. So we don't have any sticks. We're all out of sticks. All our carrots are, well, we could drop sanctions and normalize relations. But Trump's got to be hesitant about doing that because he can't give away everything too early. But that's all he's got is lifting sanctions. But the Russians are resource exporters and they're making money. They're doing okay selling east. They got an oil pipeline and a natural gas pipeline to China. They can sell their timber to whoever they want. Whatever, they're doing whatever they want. So Trump's government is clearly working hard on trying to get a ceasefire. They do have what they call I'm sorry, I forget the term for it, forgive me, action teams, some kind of crap like that, which means like third ranking guys, right? The deputy assistant secretaries of the foreign ministries are working together, hammering out as many things as they can possibly agree on before the bosses meet again next time, right? So they got third ranking guys, working as hard as they can to, and I think that's happening in good faith. I really hope that the Russians are going to treat Trump in good faith. They never got so lucky as to have a guy like him who sincerely wants to get along with them.
Well,
screw Ukraine. Ukraine shouldn't matter to America or to Russia compared to our relationship with each other. And so if Putin doesn't take the opportunity to wind this thing down and make peace and try to look like the bigger man instead of just pushing his luck and taking Kharkiv and Odessa as well, something like that, which has got to be tempting, I guess, for him at this point. If he does that, if he goes to Kharkiv and Odessa, he makes Trump look like an absolute idiot. And that's not going to play well. And so I don't know what all Trump can do about it. I hope nothing. But it means that we're not going to be friends. And so that's really Putin's choice. Is if he wants to really warm up his relationship with the United States, this is his big chance to do it. And at the beginning of Trump's administration, so we can build on 4 years of cooperation before the next guy takes power here. And so he damned better do what he can on his side to also end the war. And the Ukrainians are a wild card, but I think that they can be tamed. They're going to have to do what they're told by the major powers here.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to take any more of your time. I want to thank you very much for appearing. This is great support for me. I'll definitely continue reading the book till the end. I'll look forward to talking to you again. Would you care to tell the people where I can find your book right now?
Sure. Yeah, it's just on Amazon, or go to my website, scotthorton.org. And I'm on X at Scott Horton Show.
Well, thank you very much. Благодаря на вас, уважаеми зрители. Bye-bye.